Alright everyone, hello. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is Tuesday, the 3rd of June. I'm your host, Dan. Today I'm going to be talking about Jupiter making an ingress into Cancer, which is going to be happening about a week from now. We have just recently had Saturn make an ingress into Aries, conjoining Neptune. And so when Jupiter ingresses into Cancer, there will be a square between Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune in the early degrees of Aries. So that's basically what I'm focusing on for this video. I have to there's something about this particular transit which on one hand I'm optimistic about, and that mainly has to do with the fact that Jupiter is in much better dignity in Cancer. However, at the same time, the square to Saturn and Neptune is fairly difficult. Saturn and Neptune are in the overcoming position, which means that the good things that Jupiter is providing are going to be somewhat taxed or somewhat constrained by the force of Saturn and Neptune. There's something about, I'm going to show you some tarot cards here to sort of give you a illustration of some of the Decan dynamics. Right now, Jupiter is in the third decan of Gemini, associated with the Ten of Swords. One of the more gloomy looking tarot cards. The Ten of Swords is this one. The guy is laying with an abundant number of swords in him. The sky is very black. It's a very moody scene. And so when the first decan of Cancer in contrast shows a couple having a toast with these two cups with a little caduceus kind of spirit between them. And so Jupiter is much more dignified in this position. So this on its own is much more positive, I would say. So I'm kind of looking forward to that kind of shift of energy. And then when you take into consideration the Saturn and Neptune square, Saturn and Neptune are conjunct at the first decan of Aries, which is related to the Two of Wands, which is this tarot card. The guy here is instead of having two figures like in the Two of Cups, you have a single person standing between two wands with this globe, and he's gazing out into the horizon from the position standing on a castle ramparts. So it gives the impression that this is a nobleman, perhaps a king, perhaps a ruler, perhaps somebody who with dreams of imperial or even colonial conquest and domination. Perhaps similar to certain leaders who are seeking to expand their boundaries or expand the borders of their empire or something, right? So there's this kind of thing about, I feel when I think about this guy, I think a lot about the desire, basically, right? Like this guy is holding the globe in his hand and dreaming, desiring future conquests, future expansion of his empire. This guy wants to make his dreams into reality, right? And there's something about all this. My idea for this video is to talk about the topic of manifestation. And what it means to be an astrologer, what it means to be somebody who's into spirituality, what it means. I don't know if anybody seriously calls themselves a New Ager anymore. But what I've noticed is that if you're involved in that, there's this kind of this idea of like a greater so-called spiritual community, or like this sort of like, if you are doing things like astrology, energy work, spiritual healing, that kind of stuff, you belong to a certain kind of social milieu where you would perhaps do workshops, perhaps do events, all this kind of thing. And I find that what is common in all this, well, I feel, first of all, somewhat alien to that whole environment. I don't really know if that is where I feel at home, right? And I think there's something about that sense of foreignness or alienness to consider when you've got Saturn in its fall in Aries. Like, you've got this thing in a place that feels kind of unnatural for it, right? But regardless of talking about that whole, there's also something else that's been on my mind around all this, which has to do with skepticism, rationality, the contrasting something like the hard material sciences that have been accepted universally by a rational secular society, and the idea that something that, especially when you consider Jupiter usually has to do something with this idea of providence or faith, right? Like, there's this faith in some sort of higher principle operating behind things, giving things order and meaning, coherency, that kind of stuff, rather than just being a cold, mechanical, lifeless universe. There's some sort of animating intelligence behind it all with Jupiter, right? But there's also this idea, well, I was thinking about this idea of manifestation, right? Of this idea of like, or the idea of dreaming, having a vision, realizing that vision. And that could be, people who are religious believers or not, or spiritual believers or not, could still all relate to that basic idea of having an idea or a goal or a vision and trying to actualize it or realize it or manifest it. However, I think there's something to be considered when we start bringing in the question of skepticism towards the supernatural, the paranormal, the religious, the mystical, versus a adherence to a very cold, rational style of doing things, right? Because I have to admit, I was not raised in a religious family, and part of this had to do with my grandparents. My grandfather in particular, apparently it's interesting that like I had like Eastern European, Russian, Ukrainian family, Romanian, Polish, whatever, and some of those family members had more experience with a Russian Orthodox Church. Some of them had more experience with the Catholic Church. My grandfather apparently really didn't get along with the Catholics. And apparently there's a lot of people that have this direct first-hand experience with the Catholics that has shaped this sort of opinion against religious institutions, against Christianity, and but there's a lot of people who may be interested in a non-religious form of spirituality to somehow not throw the baby out with the bathwater, even if they have complaints against organized religion or the Catholic Church or something like that. In recent times, it seems like organized religion has become more popular or more trendy, or more. It probably has to do with the various trying economic, social, political circumstances. Has people like there's this argument that like once you're in the trenches, there's no atheists anymore, right? Like once your ass is on the line, we'll see who's, people, pretty soon all the true believers come out, because if your ass is against the wall, you might start believing in something, right? There's something about nevertheless, there's something about the context, I think, about when people talk about manifestation, that to me it feels like it's very much like in the sense of the spiritual, religious kind of manifestation, the idea that you are investing all your energy into some sort of vision or idea or dream of something that you want to happen or materialize. Specifically, like, also, I think it goes without saying that it's like there's a certain amount of this that is like you either wishing or hoping or praying even that something would happen, rather than you just figuring out what it takes to make such a thing happen and doing it with on your own, with your own volition, with your own, like, there's a sort of idea that, they say that even religious people have this idea that God helps those who helps themselves, right? And that I have often resonated with this. I also, there's a certain Jim Morrison song or song with the Doors. I have to, I don't know if I remember specifically which one it is off the top of my head, but there's this song where Jim Morrison sings at the beginning, "You shall not petition the Lord with prayer." And he screams it out, really. And there's something about that that always sort of made an impression on me, or that there's this kind of sense that there's also certain esoteric teachers who say that if you are interested in this idea of, like, realizing your dreams, or you have some goal or some sort of thing that you want to realize, it's probably better to figure out how to do that with non-spiritual, non-esoteric means, to do it in the most just bluntly mundane, ordinary, get it done kind of way, without trying to, like, pray to God to do it for you, or to, like, you're praying for the universe to make all the stars align so that everything, lands on your lap. Or it's like, if it's something you need to do, you should just do it, basically. You shouldn't, like, and that has always just kind of made sense to me intuitively, right? So for that, and also there's this whole thing about, in the whole world of, like, occult, sigil magic, stuff like that, like Aleister Crowley and stuff like that, the idea of, like, you would, like, have some sort of wish, or you have some sort of desire, and you would do some sort of ritual, or you do some sort of sigil or something like that. I had to admit that when I was a young man, at some point in time, I experimented with this, but I quickly gave it up, because what I found typically was most of the things that I was asking for were things that had already happened, or, like, you would just basically take the thing, what was going on in my life, take the things that were either most pleasurable and most desirable, and basically just say that you want more of them, right? Which is not like you're not having those things happen at all. It's just that, and it's kind of, in a sense, if you think about that these are things that most people, there's something really individual about it, right? That if there's things that any person would like and any person wouldn't like, and that any person would want more of the things they like and less of the things that they don't like. So to try to make some sort of point saying, like, please give me more of the good stuff, is kind of redundant, I would say, right? And also it sort of is a little bit like, what, wasn't that enough? Like, you maybe you had a better, maybe you got more lucky than most people, and yet, what, you want more, right? It's not good enough. You're not satisfied. You want more and more and more and more, and better and better and better. And then when does it end, right? Like, it's kind of an immature attitude, I would say, right? So for those reasons, it just never really vibed with me that much. But then it also I think depends very specifically to consider the context in which these desires, these goals, these aims are presenting themselves, right? I also have to admit, I'm pretty open about this, that I had a history with mental health challenges. I had experience in the mental health system, and in the midst of that experience, I ended up developing an attitude of being very, sick and tired, or I don't know what I would say, pessimistic about the whole premise of goals, right? And this is because in the context of, like, if you're somebody who's dealing with mental health stuff, the idea of goals are presented in a very specific context as recovery goals, and the idea that the individual has any capacity to set their own goals or determine their own goals is kind of naive, I would say, because honestly, if you are, like, what is a recovery goal? You want to stay out of the hospital? You want to go back to your job? What is actually, like, most of the recovery goals are basically just I'll give another example is that when I was faced with the mental health system, I was resistant to using the prescribed medication. I was resistant to medication compliance, right? And so if you're asking and this is also, I think it's important to consider the Saturn and Neptune and Aries kind of thing in the terms of personal will, personal choice, personal agency, personal authority, voluntary decision making, that kind of stuff. In that capacity, if you were to ask me about my goals, my goal or whatever a recovery goal might be, for me it would make more sense to say that I would want to recover the state of my life where it wasn't necessary to be on that medication, right? But you're stuck in this, to be in the mental health system in that situation, you are stuck in a situation where you don't have the choice to determine your own goals. You have goals thrust upon you, right? You have a team of mental health people who say that your goal is to stay on the medication. And if you say that if I want my goal to be to get off the medication, to eventually get free of that, I'm sorry, that goal is not allowed in the circumstance you're in. In the circumstance that you're in, you're not basically allowed to set your own goals. We're going to give you a list of goals that we choose from you, and you get to say if you want those or not, right? So at no point are they really ever your goals, right? But the thing is, I mean, you could still apply that to even what I'm doing now by making an astrology channel. It's like, you could say that, is your goal, like, do you have a goal to, like, expand and grow your channel, to get more subscribers, to make videos that get more likes, to become more popular? There's nothing about, like, nobody in their right mind would say that, no, actually my goal is to make astrology videos that are so unpopular that everybody's going to unsubscribe, everybody's going to hit the dislike button, everybody's going to abandon the channel, stop watching, everybody's going to tell everybody to avoid. Like, of course you're not going to say that. Of course you want to be more popular. Of course you want to be. It's not, like, the whole thing about this is, like, at no point, the goal is just structural. The goal is just part of the system that you're in. And at no point do you have any choice over setting that goal yourself, right? That goal is just something that is inherent in the environment that you're in, right? And basically, with all that in mind, I have a mixed attitude about the whole premise of manifesting your dreams or working towards goals, all this kind of stuff, because if you take it from an individual perspective, where you really do have agency, authority over choosing your goals, setting your own goals, even if they don't match with your society or the structure that you're in, if you have any success on those goals and they don't match the ones you're supposed to have, it may not register to the outside world around you that you're even making any progress. To them, they may just think, oh my God, he's so lost. Oh my God, his head is just so far up his ass because he's not doing what we want him to do. He's not adopting the goals that we give him as his own. He's setting his own goals. He's having his own direction. He's having his own ideas of what he wants to do. He's writing his own rules. And there's no real room to do this, I don't find, right? And then, or else you could say that, like, in that position, you could just criticize. You could say that, well, if you accept it, if you understood why society creates these goals or these objectives for you, then you would be unselfish. But if you want to set your own goals, if you want to have authority to shape your own, you're just being selfish. You're just being, you're being, you're like this guy who's not there with his partner. He's not there with his team. He's just one guy who wants to conquer the world, who wants to bend it to his own will, who doesn't care what other people think. He's just one man against the world, who wants to push his own idea, his own agenda on everybody else, whether they like it or not, right? And that, so in order to, if you want to be if you want to be incorporated into society, you have to sacrifice your own goals to let somebody else define your goals for you, right? Have like somebody else tell you what it is that you want, what it is you should be working for, what it is you should be striving for. Because if you do that yourself, it's like you're going against this whole world who has set up this whole structure that you're supposed to play into, right? Now, that being said, I also have to admit that I think in terms of like this whole idea of manifestation, realizing your dreams, realizing your goals, I think if you do forget about this whole distinction between personal goals and collective goals and all this kind of stuff, I do think there is some basic point of agreement in that when it comes to the point where the personal goals and the societal goals need not be in such conflict, right? Because at some basic point, I'll give you another example, right? Like, I've been making this astrology channel for, I don't know, I started around the time of the pandemic or so. So let's say 5 years or something. At some point, I had a health crisis, not to do with mental health, but with autoimmune, inflammation, that kind of thing. I took a little bit of a break from my channel. I came back. And one of the things about all that was that, obviously, I mean, it's kind of redundant that if you have a health crisis where you're in poor health, you obviously want to recover, you obviously want to be healthy, but this is it's kind of like this thing, like nobody in their right mind would wish not to be healthy. Everybody wants to be healthy, okay? So it's a kind of a basic goal that you want to be healthy. And you may just disagree about the means to that, right? Maybe some people, their idea of being healthy, they think they're concerned about, like, I'm on certain pharmaceutical drugs for my condition, and I actually think that they may have some effect for mental health stuff, because I think that even though it's maybe an off-label side effect, that when I go in for my pharmaceutical treatment, I find it sort of takes the edge off of my mood, or that I have a lot of, especially I think with Saturn and Neptune in Aries, I'm noticing there's a certain emotional mood component, but I find doing astrology helps for me because it gives me this context to be like, oh, okay, there's something about it where when Uranus went into Aries, that was around the time when I was really having trouble with mental health, and I didn't get into astrology until after that, right? It was actually, as a matter of fact, me working through my mental health crisis, trying to seek more esoteric, spiritual helpers, that I was more formally introduced to astrology. A guy gave me an astrology reading. I didn't even ask for one. And it was like in that suggestible state where I was like, well, everything's chaotic, everything is crazy, everything doesn't make any sense, but there's this sort of, oh, wait a minute, there's this sort of like, I'm opening up to a world where before, like, I can take astrology more seriously, or that there's something like in this state of mind, it sort of opens up that there's to all these other possibilities that previously my vision of the world seemed kind of narrow. I mean, I have to admit, I was always a little bit curious maybe about this kind of stuff, but it just sort of opened up. It like presented, it's like, it wasn't even that it was like astrology gravitated towards me, not the other way around, right? And then I just kind of had that eventually that led me to be motivated to take a course and to learn more about astrology and stuff like that. But it was like, it was in, and then, so now it's kind of like, I find that, it's not as if astrology is just the one thing which is helping me to be more stable and healthy, but the fact that I can see that there's some difficulty for Aries transits for me, but I can see the Saturn-Neptune thing, and I can relate to it in a different way than if I didn't have astrology. It's like, and it's all just materialism. It's all just, it's just like, I'm just a person like who has to take drugs or else I feel things I don't want to feel. And that's it, right? That's all there is. Like, you don't have to think about like whether these planets in your chart are activating this archetype or something like that. It's basically you feel good or you feel bad, and you just take drugs to sort of to get yourself into this feeling state, right? And that all this other stuff is a bunch of delusional stuff that that's not scientific, right? Where am I going with this? There's something about the astrology trying to be finding astrology to be helpful, but then there's something about, like I said, like when you're in the mental health system, you don't feel like you have the capacity to set your own goals unless they so happen to be the same ones that that the authorities want you to have as your goals, right? But then I find it easier recovering from other health problems because everybody just wants to be healthy because you have this instinct not to die. You want to live, you want to be healthy, you want to be fully ambulatory, you want to have your agency. And so I guess I could say that I have been focusing on that, right? I've been focusing on just staying healthy, trying to support myself the best I can. And that's good enough, I think, right? But there's there's other sorts of things that we're this whole topic of manifestation, realizing your dreams and stuff like that. I have a bit of a different way of relating to it. And it creates a bit of an obstacle for me with getting involved, I think, with the spiritual community or the astrology community and all this kind of stuff. And I find that part of this has to do with a lot of people who are, let's say, spiritual practitioners or astrologers relate to the topic of astrology in terms of like this whole thing of manifesting your dreams, right? And with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, there's this idea of Neptune being your imagination, your like this guy who is standing there with the globe and he's envisioning some future. He's going to create his empire. He's going to realize his dreams, all this kind of stuff. But Saturn is like the idea of the obstacle, the limit, and that there's this idea where we feel like we've hit a wall, right? We've hit some sort of limit or obstacle and that we're having trouble manifesting, but that there's something about in Zen they say that the obstacle is the path, right? That if you stick with the obstacle, then that is actually what helps you to manifest your dream because you're approaching it from the basic. The obstacle is the basic thing which stands in the way from something being or not being, right? It's the basic limit which, like if you have a container, like a cup that holds water, right? You have some basic limit that says on one side of the cup we have water, on the other side of the cup we don't have water, right? And so that if we want to manifest water inside the cup, you need a container for which to put it, right? And so that if you can't, to see that Saturn archetype is actually being helpful rather than not being helpful, right? But there's in that same thing, that Saturn archetype to me feels, it's not that's not the same as gatekeeping, but there's this thing about, maybe this goes with Saturn and its fallen Aries. There's something about the whole feeling like too much of an outsider to relate to other people who are dealing with this question of trying to realize your dream or manifest some kind of vision, right? And I'll give an example of that. And I'm not going to name the name of the astrologer here, but at some point in time, I think this was before I ended up having my health crisis. I was living in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, and I'd moved back in with my family. And there was this Zoom meeting for astrologers who were talking about Jupiter in Pisces at the time. Another Jupiter well-dignified sign. Of course, when Jupiter is well-dignified, people tend to talk about growth and expansion and abundance and all this kind of stuff like that. And there's something about and I don't want to make this personal or anything like that, but I suppose there is something that is actually personal about it, because I'm talking about my personal challenges or my obstacle to interacting with the collective, the mass, the community around all this. And I'm just sure my experience about this was that I had just gone from renting a place to moving back in with my family, and that I was listening to what the person who was hosting this talking about their Jupiter in Pisces as manifesting some new living situation or manifesting some new house or some sort of like working on that. And for me, I was a bit insecure because I felt like it's not the first time I've gone from renting a place to moving back in with my family. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that my mother is getting older and that she has her own health problems to deal with too now, and that if she was living on her own, she might have to sell the house, because we have this really big house that is designed for a family of, maybe it's like a house that could fit at least maybe 4 or 5, even 6 people. But if she was just living on this out of her own, it's a bit too big for her. And we have a big yard. We have lots of, I don't know. My mother struggles with all this stuff, right? And there's something about this sort of there's certain issues around codependency or interdependency of the living situation and stuff like this. There's something about all this, the idea, getting right down into it. If you go with this topic of rather than maybe it could for some other people, this could be a very kind of mundane, basic thing about I want to manifest my living space to be better, right? I've taken this sort of strategy to dealing with this channel, in that I'm not going to, if I have problems with my family, I'm going to try to address it with them and not talk about it behind their backs. But I'll just give an example, right? Is that around the time when I moved back to this house in with my family, the downstairs bathroom had some kind of electrical problem where the light in the bathroom wouldn't work. And so as a workaround, what happened, there was a light socket in the wall which did work, and so my mother put a little lamp in the bathroom, and so if you hit the light switch on the wall, the fan turns on, but the light is totally bungled up, and you have to flick this little tiny lamp on that's sitting on the sink. And it's which is it gets you, if there's certain things that are temporary solutions, right? That if you have an electrical problem in your bathroom, it's a temporary solution to set up a lamp on by the sink, right? And so that happened maybe 2021. So we're talking 4 years later, right? And 4 years of me being irritated with my mother, being why, if this is the one thing about manifestation and goal. If you want to do something, rather than I don't believe in praying to God or praying to your spirit guides to do things which could be accomplished in a very kind of a very call an electrician, right? if you don't even have to know how to fix electrical problems. You could literally call an electrician, right? Now, you could also be like, oh, well, because of the budget or something like that. The thing is, it's like for my hobbies, I do things such as like, I'm into electronic music, and I have a bunch of money that I got from my inheritance, and I have all this. I have this thing with my family, where for some reason my mother doesn't want me to spend any money on household renovations, and I am nonetheless. Like, if you ask me, like, this is what I'm trying to say about goals and desires. Like, if you have a rooms in your house where the lights don't turn on because there are electrical problems, or let's say if you have like carpets that have stains on them that you want to be replaced, or you have, let's say, let's say like you have your appliances are breaking down, they need to be fixed. We're actually pretty good about doing that quickly, because if you're used to using a dishwasher and a washing machine, like you're gonna want to have those replaced as they start to break down, right? There's this kind of thing where it's just like there are all sorts of like things that are very basic desires to like make my environment better, but for some reason in the arrangement with my family, I can't, like, I have bathrooms that don't have lights that turn on. I have carpets that are ruined that I want to replace. I have the decks that are like, there's all sorts of these little jobs that need to be done, and yet there's this total like inability to realize any of those. And it's kind of like basically because my mother doesn't want me to pay for anything, right? And this has created this kind of dynamic where it's like, okay, like I've got like, but it has more to do. It's also this kind of dynamic of like, as if you were living with a landlord, right? Like if you're living with a landlord and there's a problem with the appliances, even if you could afford it, it's not your responsibility to buy appliances for your landlord. You have to get your landlord to do that with his own money, and then if he wants to raise the rent, that's your landlord's responsibility, right? There's a certain similar dynamic with my mom, where there's, in my living situation, there's all sorts of things that I'd like to change, that I'd like to improve, and there's not of any shortage of money or time or will to do it. It's like dealing with having, like, my mother in the position of a stingy landlord who doesn't want to fix anything, who doesn't want to do anything, and you just have to sit there and like. I don't think this is actually good. There's this kind of idea. I think it works really well with Saturn and Neptune. I was watching a video on the Astrology Hub podcast. I can't remember the name of the astrologer who did it, but he was talking about Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat for Saturn and Neptune. But there's this idea of just being like, like you have your dream and you have the obstacle, but there's this kind of thing about like, instead of making practical steps towards realizing your dream, for some reason you're just resigned to suffer, right? And I don't even know if it's rational. It may not be rational at all, but there's this kind of thing of like, well, it's like there's the environment that you live in. It's like, yeah, the floors are covered. The carpets are just a mess. They need to be replaced. The lights don't turn on. Everything is just like in a state of disarray, and it feels really depressing. It makes me feel sad. I really wish there was something I could do about it. But you know what? I guess, it's been 4 years. What's 5 years? What's 6 years? We'll just stay in this place that feels depressing, that feels miserable, that I wouldn't want to invite anybody over here because it would be embarrassing. And so I feel lonely, I feel miserable, I feel hopeless. I don't have any, and then this becomes, it's just the feeling of living here, right? And then out of all this, it's just like, I have to admit, I've given up alcohol, I've given up tobacco, but I do like smoking weed. And I like smoking weed because it helps to just make the whole thing more bearable, right? But the thing is, there's this attitude that like, if you, like, by making the situation more bearable, you are enabling, right? Or that you are keeping yourself complacent with an unhappy situation. But the whole problem about this is that this actually, I don't know. I actually, and like, there's this other thing where the idea of goals and, um, like the whole point of like recovery goals is that this whole thing, the whole situation turns into this thing which produces an identity of, in this whole structure, in this whole situation, I can't, it doesn't feel like it's appropriate for, like, I feel like an outsider, basically. I don't feel like I can participate. I don't think, like, even if I really like astrology, even if I really find it helpful, because like I said, I could think about when Uranus went to Aries and I had a psychosis, right? And now I can think about how now I'm older, now I've learned about astrology, now I can see Saturn and Neptune in Aries being this thing which is having an effect on me, which, I don't know, I'm in a bad mood, I'm cranky, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling, it can lend itself to attitudes of hopelessness or doomerism. And yet there is this Jupiter that's going to go into Cancer, that's going to be a little bit more optimistic, right? That's going to maybe encourage a little bit more growth or a little bit more hope and optimism or something like that. But I feel like, in terms of, there's something about all this where I still feel out of place, because I feel like if I were to join a group of other astrologers, and there would be a lot of energy put in this whole thing about, how you manifesting the changes that you want to see in your life. And it would just be like, I don't know, I've been stuck with the same problems for years and years and years that I can't fix. And it's not because I don't have enough money. It's not because I don't have a will to do it. It's because it's just like if I don't understand, like, I feel like I'm caught in a time warp, right? I feel like my family, like there's certain, like, there's things that are just like things that you could problems you could deal with in a month that takes like 3 years to deal with. And it's like all these things that you could do really easily and do really quickly. That's not how we do it around here. It's like, if you have all the money to spend on it, you're not allowed to spend money on it because you're not the home. I'm not technically. It's not my house. I'm not the homeowner, right? I can't. So it's like, it's not a matter of like, I need to make more money to afford to solve this problem. It's a problem of like, you have one person in a position where they're the boss, they call the shots. And it's like, as long as you live in this situation, that's how it's going to be. That you either, like, the whole thing is basically structured. I honestly think that it's structured in a way where it creates dissatisfaction on purpose, just to use that as a motivator to fuel basically social atomization, right? There's this other whole issue around individualism and independence that I feel are maybe I could talk about in another video, right? Because I think in some way to be, I think it's a misnomer to talk about individualism and independence, or like, the Western individualism, right? Because if individualism, if everybody feels like they have to be an individual, and basically, when confronted with the same circumstance, there's only one choice: to be an individual, right? And all the individuals do the same thing, as they're not really individuals, right? Or to be independent, right? To be independent from, like in this situation, is to be independent from a situation that feels hopeless, that feels frustrating that you can't do anything with, so you can put yourself in a situation that when you have a bunch of people to get together and talk about what dreams they want to manifest and realize, that you don't feel like you're just like, oh well fuck, I guess I'll just see myself out because I am just like there's nothing I can do to realize any of my goals, any of my dreams, any of my desires is just hopeless, right? Because even the most basic things, it's just like a brick wall staring you in the face, right? The most basic things that like any normal person could just call the electrician, get him to fix the light, but you can't because you have to live your life in ignorance and darkness, and that you have to live in a miserable circumstance because you don't get the message, right? Because it's the symbolism of your own ignorance, right? I'm so ignorant that I have to piss in the dark my whole fucking life and forget what year it is. How many years has the goddamn, I don't know. Maybe I'm picking one minor detail as a point of resentment where there may be a bigger issue. It's not just about having my bathroom light, having a stupid lamp that I have to flick on my bathroom light. I don't have the light bulb, but there's this kind of thing is that like I don't feel empowered to make those decisions, right? But the thing is, it's like the whole point is like it's true that I'm not a homeowner, right? And that I live in an area that's so expensive that to be a homeowner is like, you know, so outside my realm of, you know, it'd be to imagine, like, but then at the same time I talk to astrologers, if I'm working with astrologers, they look at my chart and they'll say like, oh, you're destined to be wealthy, you're destined to be, you know, to be a person who has all this wealth and power, but and yet I can't even fucking change my bathroom, get my bathroom lights to work, right? Because it feels like there's a certain sense of hopelessness about it all, right? And I don't know. I think there's this other conversation to be had about hope, or like optimism and pessimism versus hopefulness, right? I just recently started reading a Byung handbook about hope, and he was talking about. I've only read the first chapter, but he was saying that. In order for hope to mean anything, there's a difference between hope and optimism. He says that optimism is when you're perceiving a situation and you're optimistic, it means that there's something that you can directly perceive about that situation that gives you reason to be optimistic, right? There's nothing, you're not speculating about anything that's not readily apparent. You're just looking at the basic factual reality of what is and saying, you know, this isn't so bad. I'm appraising this as being pretty good, right? He's saying that hope is different from that because in order for hope to mean anything, you have to look at the situation and accept the negativity of it. First of all, you have to deal with the negativity of the situation. You have to deal with rather than optimism, which sees that there's something in the situation which gives you reason to be optimistic. You have to deal with a situation that doesn't give you that. You have to deal with a situation where you're like, oh shit, there's nothing, I don't have any reassurance to be optimistic about in the situation, right? Like, it's not about like, oh, based on, like, when it comes to like, I don't know if it makes sense to use the bathroom light in this example, but based on all the information about the situation that presents itself, I don't have reason to be optimistic that this problem is just going to correct itself on its own immediately, right? And actually, I would have more. I'd be more, if I was going to make a bet, I would put my money on pessimism that there's that and maybe many other problems are just not going to be fixed, right? I can have a barter. All these issues with my house, are they within the time span of 1 year? Are they going to get fixed or are they not? I'm going to put all my money on not getting fixed, just based on how it's been going over the last few years. I don't see this. I'm not predicting a sudden turnaround where we're going to be really productive and we're going to solve all these problems. We're probably not going to be very productive. We're probably not going to accomplish very much. We're probably going to feel depressed, not very active, kind of hopeless, cynical, pessimistic, right? But hope, the idea of hope, though, is that there could be some thing, like with Jupiter going into Cancer, maybe there's some outside force that you're hoping for, something that isn't here yet, right? Maybe there's some other factor that, because we are limited in our perception, we are limited in. What's good about astrology is astrology gives you a way to cheat in a way, right? Because the whole thing about hope in astrology is that it expands your range of optimism, right? Because if I didn't do astrology, I would just look at the situation and I would say, let's look at the situation. There's under these astrological dynamics, there's not really much to be hopeful for. But then once we get a nice, well-dignified Jupiter in Cancer, maybe with that archetypal energy that's coming in the future, maybe there'd be something to hope for, which is outside of what I can perceive in this situation. But because I'm an astrologer, I can perceive that, right? But if I wasn't doing astrology, all I would be faced with is this cold, hard, material reality where you have to, if you want your bathroom light to be changed, you got to learn how to be an electrician, you got to pay for one, or you got to fight with your parents, or you got to fight with your landlord, give them hell, and then they'll, right? But why does it have to be so difficult, right? Why does it have to be so frustrating? Why does the most simple problems have to, it's this thing of I think there's also something to consider about resentment, or making a mountain out of a molehill. That there's some kind of existential pain and suffering that I associate with not being able to fix the electricity in my bathroom, that is more than just a practical thing about having light in my bathroom or not. It's this futility of life regardless of whether I want to change things, improve things, make things better, make my own living, my day-to-day life, it's there's a sense of futility and hopelessness where you will only make progress if you accept the rules of some authority that exists above you, right? In the same way that if I was in the mental health system and my personal goal was to come off antipsychotics, they would just be they wouldn't register that. They're the only goal you're allowed to have is the ones that we give to you. You're not allowed to set your own goals. You're not allowed to have your own ambitions. You're not allowed to have your own dreams. You're not allowed to dream, basically. You're not allowed to envision. If you live somewhere, it's this idea that if you have your day-to-day life, the world that you inhabit, and if you envision an improvement, a better way to be, that dream only exists to make you miserable, to make you sad, to make you hopeless. An idea of the way that things that could be, but the world is set up in such a way to deny that for you, just to make you feel depressed, just to make you feel hopeless, just to make you feel like you have no power over your life, that you can't change anything, or that when you go to a meeting with other astrologers and they get together to talk about all the things that they're working on in their life, just to accentuate the fact that you don't belong there, because you're just a fuck up who, all the normal things that other people have to deal with, in life, that you are apparently, you have no power to have, if you want reasonable things in your life, you're an outsider to that, right? You're complete, there's a certain people who have the privilege to be able to set their own goals, to dream their own dreams, to actualize their own visions, but not you. Not you. You're an outsider. You're a misfit. You're a fuck up. And from that, you are fated to live the life of a fuck up, in which your dreams are just seen to be some errant fantasy of something that nobody takes seriously, something that no one is going to listen to, that's not valid, that's not relevant, and that mean nothing, basically, right? And for that reason, that's why I don't know. I'm kind of trying to work this out where I don't participate in a lot of online group things, because even if I want to have connection with other people, I find it puts pressure on all these little problems that mainly have to do with my family circumstance, my living circumstance, and that I feel, or that, and this is also primarily to do with, if I wasn't in the circumstance, I'd be dealing with a goddamn landlord, right? Which may not even be, and that's another point of tension, right? The point of tension is that I feel like the structure of the situation puts a lot of pressure on housing, a lot of pressure on that kind of stuff, and in such a way that feels very restrictive, like you're backed into a corner, like you have no options. And it's just hopeless, and you have to be. And this, again, I'm not making this up. The Astrology Hub podcast talked about this dynamic, Saturn and Neptune, just being resigned to suffer. Right? It's like it should be so easy just to solve little problems and make improvements, but apparently not. Apparently, the molehill really is a mountain in this case, and there are all these little things in your life which it's like. It also reminds me of this meme where, like, this guy tries to, like, make his own sushi at home, but, like, screws up rolling the sushi and then just collapses crying and, like, I'm an idiot, I'm a moron, I can't do anything, right? Like, this is kind of what this one feels like, but what I'm trying to say is that there's at least there is the Jupiter in Cancer, I think, provides hope in the sense that there could be, once Jupiter moves into Cancer, maybe things will change in such a way that there will be some sort of assistance or help for this that we don't have the way to perceive just on our own with our own limited perception of things. Okay, so this is my attempt for today's video. If you've watched it to the end, I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more. Dan's Astrology is here to stay. Keep on rocking in the free world.